name's Laudon Schuett, and this is the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. Today we're going to talk a little bit about tone. Now, at this point, you've been playing through a few pieces, you've been working on your rhythm, you've been working on your right hand technique, you've been working on your left hand technique, and I think it's a good moment to take some time to think about something maybe that you haven't had the chance to think about. You're so worried about everything that's going on the page, you're learning to read lute tablature, there's all these technical things going on, and we can sometimes forget what drew us to the instrument in the first place. And I think most of us would say the sound of the lute is what pulled us in. I mean, I know for me, it was hearing the sound of the lute, particularly in a beautiful space. I heard it in Organ Hall at Arizona State University. It's a very resonant room. It's very beautiful. And I heard it was Paul Odette who would end up being my teacher. He played a concert, and the lute was just such a magical sound, especially in there. I'm so glad I didn't hear it in some awful carpeted room with terrible acoustics, because even a great player can really be diminished by that. So I kind of want to have everyone take a moment to pause and to reflect on the sound that they're making on the instrument. Now, I know in some of the previous episodes, like the right hand episode, I've talked about, okay, let's make sure we get a full sound. But I think it's a good reminder that as you're going through and you're playing your pieces, we need to listen to every note we play, and we need to assess whether we're happy with that sound that we're making. It's so easy from behind the instrument to just ignore that and focus on other things. And for the audience and for the listeners, the sound of the instrument is so important. It may not necessarily, especially for untrained listener, they may not necessarily say, oh, the tone wasn't very good, or I really like the tone, but I think it's this sort of overall feeling that can make somebody enjoy the music a lot more. Now, what is tone? I think it's important to say that tone isn't a particular color. So if you are playing a note and you're playing and you're getting a very dark sound, something like, or I should go even darker than that. Let's do sort of a sweet sound. Or if you're doing something very bright. They have very different qualities, and they both can have good or bad tone. So I don't like to combine color with tone, and I, in the sense that I don't like to associate a certain color with good tone. I think if you're a Baroque lute player and you're going for a brighter sound, or maybe you're looking at some repertoire with the thumb out, you're going to get a very different color, I think, with thumb out. You can still get a really good tone. So a good tone is, we often use the word round to describe it, or full. And I'm going to do something kind of funny to demonstrate the opposite of that. Because this hand, I've trained it. I was practicing a little bit before this video. I was going, okay, can I make a bad sound with this? And I think just because it's so allergic to it, it's going to be hard to demonstrate. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to flip the lute over. I'm going to play you a few notes with my other hand to kind of give you a sense of what a bad tone is. And this is a completely untrained hand. And I have to fight the urge to try to make it better, because I think if I really think about it, I can get a decent sound. So I have to kind of, and you can hear it's just sort of thin, and I'm sort of grazing the string. Sometimes students will get some nail in there, extra sound or extra things. I found with my right hand, my index finger, I tend to get very dry skin on my index finger, and that, especially in the winter months, can be very aggravating, because I'll get a nice warm full sound with my middle finger and then with my thumb, and then when I go in to do my index finger, right now it's the summer and I've been moisturizing, but I'll get a thin kind of, it just drives me bonkers. So a couple things that you can do, I mean, first of all, what I would do is maybe take a day to pause from your repertoire. So you're working on your pieces, you're trying to get your rhythm worked out. Just take a day, sit down with your lute. And one thing I find is that most people, it's easiest to get a good tone from your thumb. And I believe I did talk about this a little bit in the right hand video, which is like to use your thumb as a reference point. So now that you've played some pieces and you're kind of in the thick of things, what I'd like you to do is just take your thumb, and your goal is to really dig into the string a bit, really make sure you're making good contact, because another thing that beginners often do is they sort of brush the string. So you get these I'm doing it with the other hand just so you can kind of recreate that. They'll sort of very lightly graze the string. And what we want to do is we just want to really dig into it a bit more. Get a nice big sound. Okay. And then you're going to recreate that with your other fingers. And then, of course, try it on different strings. And, you know, this is just really a recap of the basic right hand idea. But now what we're going to do is we're also going to try to do it with chords, right? So you've been working on your chords. Maybe you got a couple chords to grab. We'll grab this nice G chord. What you can do is play the notes individually. Make sure you like the sound that you're getting. And if you're playing very dark, you know, we make sure it's still full. If we're playing very bright, again, the danger with playing on the brighter side of things sometimes, again, is that kind of raspy, thin sound. So we want bright with kind of a thick sound. So lots of flesh, I find, in general, is the best way to get a good sound. Everybody's a little different, so you may have to play around a little bit. Say you're doing thumb out and you're in kind of a brighter position. Just working on getting a nice, solid sound. Or if you're thumb under, that's close enough for now, for what we're doing. Just getting a beautiful, beautiful sound. And of course, everything is subjective here. You may run into a situation where you're playing a piece, maybe you're accompanying a vocalist, and the vocalist is like, the words or something like, you know, my dying breath, or, you know, my rattling voice. Okay, fine. Then you could totally do something like, and get some really, really ugly sounds out of there. So we're not talking about that. We're just talking about your sort of baseline sound. And again, we want to practice that with different colors and different hand positions, because I do think there is this tendency, especially amongst classical guitar players, to think like good tone is a sort of dark sound that's really beautiful. But you can have a beautiful bright sound. And I think that's really, really important to get across, because I think sometimes we go, oh, that tone is bad just because it's bright. Sometimes it is, but we can get a really beautiful bright sound as well. For those of you who are doing thumb out, for those of you who are doing later repertoire. And I say that, you know, it could be earlier repertoire. I mean, if you're doing a bright dance by Dalza or something like that, you might want a brighter sound, but you still might want good tone. I mean, if you think of the beginning of that famous collada, right, you could have an opening where it's a sort of darker, that sort of thing, or you could go brighter. Something like that. I haven't played that piece in years, but I think the you can play around with those colors and change the mood of the piece very, very easily, but we still want that good tone. Now, it's one thing to sit down and kind of take a day separate of your music and get a good sound, right? But let's say, okay, you put your music in front of you. I've got the little Scots tune in front of me, and you sit down and you go, and you're already distracted. You're already like, oh, I'm figuring out these notes. And I know I've brought this up a lot, and I do bring it up a lot with my students, but really slowing down and chaining can be really, really helpful. So, for example, you look at something like a Scots tune, and you play the very first chord, and you just take a moment to assess the sound that you're hearing. Make sure you're happy with it. And I part of it is that if you're making a bad sound, it needs to bother you. So you do have to kind of train yourself to be bothered by bad tone, especially behind the instrument. I think when you're a listener or an audience member, it's a little easier to just say, "Oh, that person has bad tone," or "I don't like that sound." But behind the instrument, we need to, and I think this could be true of any issue that you have, is you have to be bothered by it. That's the first step to fixing something. So you're going to go through, and let's say you make a sound, and it's like, let me try to just make a bad sound here. Let's do something like that, and you don't like that sound. So you'll just take your time and get the sound that you want. And very often I find that students will pluck and forget. They'll just move on to the next thing. They shouldn't forget. They just stop paying attention to what they plucked. And I'm sure I mentioned this in a previous video, but I think you need to listen to the sound that you are making. And when you're happy with that, you add the next note. And you reflect. You say, okay, am I happy with that? And you might be happy with the sound, but you decide, oh, I want to do that brighter. You need a little work to get that the way you want it to sound. Like, I find when I go brighter that I need to get a good sound, I'm actually hitting farther up the flesh of my index finger. So when I am closer to the rose or over the rose, I'm using a little less flesh, sort of to pluck, especially the index finger notes. And then when I get back here, I need to get a little more in there to get the sound that I like. So just taking your time and really going note by note and reflecting on what you're doing, and training yourself to be bothered, so that when you pick up the lute the next morning, and maybe you didn't like that sound, and you go, okay, I need to work on this, and I need to work on it a little more. And you're like, almost there. Okay, that's a little bit better. But just taking small chunks and listening very, very critically and carefully, and then adjusting it. And I think the mistake is you'll read a book, or you'll get a piece of advice, which is like, I'll hear this all the time, like, you should be plucking at a whatever degree angle, and your fingers should be going through this way and doing it this way. Because our physiology is so different, one person from the next, I think that to really get it to the level that maybe you want, at the highest level that you can, is that it is much more efficient to instead use your ears, to build up your ears as critical listening devices that assess what sound you're producing, and then you make small adjustments to the angle of attack till you find the sweet spot. And your angle of attack, or the amount of flesh you use, is going to be different from me. I've met students that they get beautiful tone without even trying, and maybe they just it's the shape of their fingers, or there's something like that. I've never felt like it came naturally to me. I feel like I've got kind of, like I said, dry skin on that index finger. I feel like I don't have a lot of fat on my fingertips, so it's a little bony. So I have to kind of work to find those angles. If you're somebody who automatically gets great tone, great, excellent, then skip this lesson. That's awesome. And if you're someone who has different ideas about tone than me, if you're thinking, well, I do like that brittle sound. Maybe, for example, you are a Baroque lute player who feels strongly about playing really close to the bridge and having a more brittle and bright sound. I don't want to say everyone who plays close to the bridge wants a brittle sound, but maybe that is your aesthetic. I'm just trying to come up with an example here. And you just disagree with me. That's fine. That's fine. I think as long as it's a choice and you're not doing it sort of ignorantly, if you're not doing it without knowledge, I think if you listen to yourself and you listen to me and you go, I don't agree with Laudon's approach to tone. That's great. We need variety. We need people coming at things from different directions. But if you take anything away from this video, this lesson, what I would say is that you should think about it. You should think about your sound, and you should be thinking about it even as a beginner. I've so often, people are just like, oh, I'm just trying to play the notes. I'm just trying to play the notes. But you will sound, even playing a very simple little piece like this Scots tune, if you have a really good sound, you will sounds out. You will sound to other players and to listeners like a much more experienced musician than you may actually be. I think it's so often we put the tone off and our sound for a long time. We work on our technique, we work on our speed, we work on reading, we work on all these left hand things. So take this week, take this lesson as a moment to kind of pause and reflect. And this is something you can come back to over and over again. You spend a few weeks. I'm going to do an episode on advanced bars coming up, and you might spend some days working on some really interesting left hand techniques, and then you need to come back and think about your tone. So this is a meditative time, and then try to integrate it into your regular practice. Like I said, if you haven't been using chaining, I really highly recommend it. It's changed things a lot for me. I kind of use 3 techniques when tackling really difficult stuff. I isolate problem spots. I will learn to play something very slowly and very carefully and then pop it into tempo. And then the other thing is the chaining. And all of that is to allow you to assess individual moments and make sure that the quality is high. We're just making sure that we want that. It can be really, really easy to just kind of go. Recording, the final thing I'll say is that recording yourself can be helpful. It can also be problematic because if you don't know anything about recording, you can actually deceive yourself. You can sound better than you do, or you can sound way worse. Often you sound way worse in the recording than you actually do. So, however you record yourself, I would try to be consistent about it. Some little tips. Most microphones, especially on the low end, you want a little farther away. The higher end, you can get a little bit closer. Try to be consistent about your microphone placement. Place it in the same place so that if you make a change in your playing, you're listening back and you're hearing that. Keep an eye on your settings. Make sure your settings stay consistent. iPhones and things like that aren't great for checking tone just because they pick up a lot of the environmental noise. They work best from a distance. Something like a H4 hand recorder is nice. Popping this in and finding a good distance. You don't want it too close, or you're going to pick up a lot of the hand noise of just things touching, which nobody in the audience will pick up on unless it's really loud. Putting the recording device there and playing a very short passage, nothing long. It could even be just a couple notes, and then sitting and immediately listening back and then making some changes, record the same passage over again, and see if those changes improve the sound. And then playing for other people, especially experienced lute players, and saying, how does this sound? Do you like the sound of this? And if possible, not over the internet, just in person, because things like Zoom and FaceTime, the lute just sounds terrible. So try to get some live advice. And if you don't have access to a lute player, you can have a guitar player. You can even just ask a family member who has maybe listened to a lot of music before and just say, hey, how does this sound? Like, do you like the sound of this? And you can do a lot of experimentation that way. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you find it useful. I don't think there's a whole lot new in it. It's just a reminder to step back from a lot of the technical things you're working on and get back to what got you into the lute in the first place, which I think for most people is just the sound of the instrument, which is really beautiful. One final thing, getting a good sound in a bad place, like, you know, on carpet or in a really muffled room, that's a great challenge. So if you've kind of worked out your sound and your tone and you're feeling like you need an additional challenge, I always remembered having to play for students in like basement classrooms at universities with terrible carpeting and all of that. And it always broke my heart that that was maybe the first time a lot of people heard the lute. But it is a really, really good challenge to see if you can get a good sound in a room like that and project and have that full sound. So for those of you who are maybe a little farther ahead on the tone thing, start challenging yourself and seeing if you can get good quality results in different locations. Happy practicing, happy luting. If you're enjoying the channel, consider subscribing. That helps me a lot, starts to get the numbers up. If you really have been enjoying it and you want to support it in other ways, I do have a Patreon link in the description. But this series will always be free, and I'll keep it up as long as YouTube lets me. So have a wonderful week. Happy practicing. Bye-bye.